Dr. Amelia Johnson pulled into the driveway of her new home for the very first time as its owner. The keys felt heavy in her hand, not because of their weight, but because of what they represented. After 12 years of medical school, residency, and fellowship training, followed by another 5 years of saving every penny she could, she finally owned a house. Not just any house, but a beautiful colonial-style home in Willowbrook Heights, one of the most sought-after neighborhoods in the city. The house stood majestically at the end of Maple Street, with its red brick facade and white shutters gleaming in the afternoon sun. The front yard was perfectly landscaped with mature oak trees that provided just the right amount of shade, and flower beds that bloomed with colorful roses and tulips. A stone pathway led from the sidewalk to the front porch, where 2 white columns supported a small roof that would provide shelter during rainy days. Amelia stepped out of her car and took a deep breath. The air smelled different here than it did outside her cramped apartment downtown. It smelled cleaner, fresher, with hints of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. She could hear birds chirping in the trees and the distant sound of children playing in a nearby yard. This was exactly the kind of peaceful environment she had dreamed of during those long nights at the hospital when she was working 18-hour shifts. As a cardiologist at City General Hospital, Amelia's days were filled with life and death decisions, emergency surgeries, and the constant pressure of saving lives. Her work was rewarding, but it was also exhausting. She had always imagined coming home to a place where she could truly relax, where she could sit on her own porch with a cup of tea and watch the sunset, without hearing ambulance sirens or the beeping of medical equipment. The moving truck arrived right on schedule, and the crew began unloading her belongings. She didn't have much furniture yet, but she had carefully chosen each piece. There was the comfortable reading chair she had bought after her first year as an attending physician, the dining table where she planned to host dinner parties for her colleagues, and the beautiful wooden bookshelf that would hold her collection of medical journals and mystery novels. As the movers carried her boxes into the house, Amelia noticed several neighbors peeking out from behind their curtains. She waved cheerfully at a woman across the street who was watering her garden, but the woman quickly looked away and went inside. Amelia shrugged it off, thinking that people in suburban neighborhoods were probably just more private than city dwellers. The interior of the house was everything she had hoped for. The living room had large windows that let in plenty of natural light, and the kitchen was spacious enough for her to actually cook real meals instead of surviving on hospital cafeteria food and takeout. Upstairs, the master bedroom had a beautiful view of the backyard, where she could already imagine herself having morning coffee while watching the sunrise. By evening, most of her boxes were inside, though it would take weeks to properly unpack everything. Amelia ordered pizza from a local restaurant and sat on her front porch steps eating dinner while watching her new neighborhood come to life. People were arriving home from work, children were riding bicycles on the sidewalks, and dog walkers were making their evening rounds. She noticed that every house on the street was immaculately maintained. The lawns were perfectly mowed, the driveways were spotless, and not a single piece of trash could be seen anywhere. Even the mailboxes looked like they had been recently painted. It was clear that the residents of Willowbrook Heights took great pride in their community. As she finished her pizza, Amelia pulled out the thick folder of documents she had received when she bought the house. Among them was a copy of the Homeowners Association rules and regulations. She had skimmed through it during the buying process, but now she wanted to read it more carefully. The HOA seemed to have rules about everything: what colors you could paint your house, how tall your grass could be, where you could park your car, and even what types of decorations were allowed in front yards. Some of the rules seemed a bit strict to Amelia, but she understood that they were designed to maintain property values and keep the neighborhood looking beautiful. She had no problem following reasonable guidelines. After all, she had invested her life savings in this house, and she wanted to protect that investment just as much as her neighbors did. The next morning, Amelia woke up to the sound of birds singing outside her bedroom window, instead of traffic and construction noise. She made coffee in her new kitchen and sat in her backyard, planning how she would spend her first weekend as a homeowner. She wanted to visit the local nursery to buy some plants for the flower beds, and she was thinking about having a small housewarming party to introduce herself to the neighbors. As she was enjoying her peaceful morning, Amelia heard the sound of high heels clicking on pavement. Through her kitchen window, she could see a woman walking down the street with a clipboard in her hand. The woman was probably in her late 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and wearing a crisp white blouse with pressed khaki pants. She stopped at each house, making notes on her clipboard and taking photos with her phone. When the woman reached Amelia's house, she stood at the end of the driveway for several minutes, writing extensively on her clipboard. Amelia wondered if this was some kind of neighborhood welcome committee, or perhaps someone from the city conducting a survey. She considered going outside to introduce herself, but the woman finished her notes and moved on to the next house before Amelia could decide. Later that afternoon, while Amelia was unpacking boxes in her living room, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she could see the same woman from the morning, still carrying her clipboard. Amelia opened the door with a friendly smile, ready to meet her first neighbor. The woman looked Amelia up and down with a critical expression that immediately made her feel uncomfortable. There was something in the woman's eyes that seemed cold and unwelcoming, very different from the friendly neighbors Amelia had hoped to meet. But she maintained her smile and waited for the woman to speak. This was Margaret Henderson, though Amelia didn't know it yet. Margaret had been living in Willowbrook Heights for 15 years and had been the president of the Homeowners Association for the last 8. She considered herself the unofficial guardian of the neighborhood's standards and reputation. When she saw the moving truck at the house on Maple Street, she had made it her business to find out exactly who was moving into her carefully maintained community. Margaret's investigation had already begun, and she had very specific ideas about what kind of people belonged in Willowbrook Heights. As she stood on Amelia's porch that afternoon, she had no idea that she was about to set in motion a series of events that would ultimately change everything. She thought she knew about power, assumptions, and the true meaning of community. Margaret Henderson stood on Amelia's porch, her clipboard held firmly against her chest like a shield. Her pale blue eyes swept over Amelia from head to toe, taking in every detail. Amelia was wearing comfortable jeans and a simple t-shirt, perfectly appropriate for a Saturday afternoon of unpacking, but Margaret's expression suggested she found something lacking in this casual attire. "Good afternoon," Margaret said in a voice that carried no warmth despite her polite words. "I'm Margaret Henderson, president of the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. I'm here to speak with the homeowner about some concerns regarding this property." Amelia's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. "Concerns? I just moved in yesterday. I'm Dr. Amelia Johnson and I am the homeowner. Is there something I can help you with?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced past Amelia into the house as if expecting to see someone else emerge from the shadows. "You're saying you're the actual owner of this property? Not a renter or house sitter?" "That's correct," Amelia replied, her voice remaining steady despite the odd nature of the question. "I purchased this house 3 weeks ago. The closing was on Thursday and I moved in yesterday. Is there some kind of problem?" Margaret consulted her clipboard, flipping through several pages with exaggerated importance. "Well, there are several issues that need immediate attention. First, I noticed there was a moving truck parked on the street for several hours yesterday. According to HOA Regulations Section 4.2, all moving activities must be pre-approved and completed within a 6-hour window." Amelia blinked in confusion. "I wasn't aware of that requirement. The moving company was very efficient and they were gone by 6 in the evening. I didn't think it would be a problem since it was just one day." "Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse," Margaret replied crisply. "Every homeowner receives a copy of the HOA regulations with their purchase documents. I assume you've read them thoroughly?" "I've reviewed them, yes," Amelia said, though she was beginning to feel like she was being interrogated rather than welcomed to the neighborhood. "I plan to follow all the guidelines. What other concerns did you have?" Margaret made another note on her clipboard. "I also observed that your garbage bins were visible from the street this morning. Section 7.1 clearly states that trash receptacles must be stored out of sight except on designated pickup days." Amelia glanced toward her driveway, where she had indeed left the bins after the garbage. Truck had emptied them earlier that morning. She had planned to move them back to the garage after lunch but had gotten distracted with unpacking. "You're absolutely right," Amelia said, deciding to take a diplomatic approach. "I'll move them right away. I'm still getting used to the schedule and routine here. I appreciate you letting me know." Margaret didn't look satisfied with this reasonable response. Instead, she seemed almost disappointed that Amelia wasn't arguing with her. "There's also the matter of your landscaping. I noticed some of the flower beds look overgrown, and there are weeds visible from the street. This comment struck Amelia as particularly unfair. The previous owners had maintained the landscaping beautifully, and while a few weeds had sprouted in the past week, the yard was far from overgrown. She suspected that Margaret was looking for problems that didn't really exist. I was actually planning to do some gardening this weekend, Amelia replied. I want to keep the yard looking as beautiful as it did when I fell in love with this house. See that you do, Margaret said, making another note. Property values in this neighborhood are among the highest in the city, and we intend to keep them that way. Every homeowner has a responsibility to maintain standards. As Margaret turned to leave, she paused and looked back at Amelia. One more thing. I'll need to see your proof of ownership and HOA registration documents. There seems to be some confusion in our records. Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in Margaret's tone that suggested this wasn't a routine administrative request. Confusion about what exactly? Just bring the documents to the HOA office on Monday morning, Margaret said, avoiding the question. 9 a.m. sharp. And make sure you bring photo identification as well. After Margaret left, Amelia stood in her doorway for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. She had expected her first interaction with the HOA to be a friendly welcome, perhaps with information about community events or helpful tips about local services. Instead, she felt like she had just been inspected and found wanting. Over the next few days, Amelia tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling from her encounter with Margaret. She focused on making her house feel like home, unpacking her belongings and establishing routines in her new neighborhood. She bought flowers for the front beds, carefully moved her trash bins to the garage immediately after pickup, and even read through the entire HOA manual again to make sure she understood every rule. But Margaret's scrutiny didn't end with that first visit. On Tuesday morning, as Amelia was leaving for work, she noticed Margaret standing on the sidewalk in front of her house, taking photos with her phone. When their eyes met, Margaret didn't wave or offer any explanation. She simply finished taking her pictures and walked away. On Wednesday evening, Amelia found a violation notice tucked under her windshield wiper. According to the official-looking document, her car had been parked askew in her driveway, creating an unsightly appearance that violated community aesthetic standards. The notice demanded that she take immediate corrective action and warned that future violations could result in fines. Amelia studied her driveway carefully, trying to figure out what could possibly be considered askew about her parking. Her car was completely within the boundaries of her own driveway, not blocking any sidewalks or neighboring property. If anything, it was parked more neatly than many of the other cars she had observed in the neighborhood. On Thursday, another violation notice appeared, this time citing her for leaving a package on her front porch for more than 24 hours. The package had actually arrived that morning and contained medical journals she had ordered, but according to the notice, it had been observed on her porch the previous evening. Amelia was certain this was incorrect, but the notice warned that disputing violations could result in additional penalties. By Friday, Amelia was beginning to understand that she was being targeted. When she checked her mailbox that evening, she found not one but 3 violation notices waiting for her. One cited her for excessive noise during unauthorized hours, referring to what Margaret claimed were power tools heard from her property after 8 p.m. In reality, Amelia had been using a handheld vacuum cleaner to clean her car mats around 7:30, well within any reasonable noise ordinance. The second notice accused her of unauthorized garden modifications for pulling weeds from her flower beds without HOA approval. The third cited her for improper mailbox positioning, claiming that her mailbox was 2 inches closer to the street than regulations allowed, despite the fact that she had never touched the mailbox and it had been in the same position when she bought the house. That weekend, Amelia decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to observe how other residents maintained their properties. What she discovered made her blood boil. Several houses had cars parked at odd angles in their driveways. Multiple properties had packages sitting on porches, some clearly there for several days based on the weather damage. Gardens throughout the neighborhood showed signs of minor weeds and overgrowth, and at least 3 mailboxes appeared to be positioned exactly like hers or even closer to the street. As she walked past Margaret's own house, Amelia couldn't help but notice that Margaret's garden hose was lying across her front walkway, clearly visible from the street, and her garbage bins were sitting beside her garage rather than inside it. According to the rules Margaret had cited to Amelia, both of these would constitute violations. It was becoming clear that the rules were being applied very selectively, and Amelia was the only one receiving this level of scrutiny. She thought about the way Margaret had questioned whether she was really the homeowner, the surprise in her voice when Amelia confirmed her ownership, and the suspicious requests for additional documentation. As a successful professional who had worked hard to achieve her goals, Amelia had unfortunately encountered this type of treatment before, though never quite so blatantly. She recognized the pattern of someone who had made assumptions about who belonged in certain spaces and who didn't, and was now trying to find ways to justify those assumptions. Standing in her beautiful new neighborhood, looking at the house she had worked so hard to afford, Amelia made a decision. She wasn't going to be intimidated or driven away by someone's narrow-minded prejudices. If Margaret wanted to play games with HOA rules, then Amelia would learn to play them better than anyone else. The harassment escalated quickly after Amelia's first week in Willowbrook Heights. What had started as overly strict rule enforcement began to feel like a deliberate campaign to make her life miserable. Margaret seemed to have appointed herself as Amelia's personal supervisor, appearing at the most inconvenient times with new complaints and demands. On Monday morning, as Amelia was getting ready for work, she heard the familiar sound of high heels clicking up her driveway. Through her bedroom window, she could see Margaret approaching her front door with her ever-present clipboard and a large camera hanging around her neck. Amelia quickly finished getting dressed and opened the door before Margaret could ring the bell. "Good morning, Dr. Johnson," Margaret said with false politeness. "I'm here to conduct a routine property inspection. According to HOA bylaws section 12.3, board members have the right to inspect any property for compliance violations." Amelia frowned, clutching her coffee cup tighter. "I'm sorry, but I'm getting ready for work. Could we schedule this for another time? Also, I'd like to see that section of the bylaws because I don't remember reading about unannounced inspections." Margaret's smile became more strained. "The inspection won't take long. I just need to document the current condition of your property for our records. You're not trying to hide anything, are you?" The implication in Margaret's tone was clear, and Amelia felt her patience beginning to wear thin. "Of course not, but I have patients to see at the hospital and I can't be late. Can we please arrange a mutually convenient time? I suppose I could come back later," Margaret said reluctantly, though she was already taking photos of Amelia's front porch area. "But I'll need you to be present for the full inspection. Some of the other board members have concerns about this property." After Margaret left, Amelia called her neighbor directly across the street, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. Mrs. Patterson had been one of the few neighbors to actually wave back when Amelia had tried to be friendly during her first week. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Dr. Johnson from across the street. I was wondering if you could help me understand something about the HOA. Has Margaret Henderson ever conducted property inspections at your house?" There was a long pause before Mrs. Patterson responded. "Well, no, dear. I can't say that she has. She's always been very particular about the rules, but I've never had anyone come inspect my property. Is everything all right?" "I'm not sure," Amelia admitted. "She seems to be finding a lot of violations that I'm having trouble understanding. Have you noticed her taking photos of other houses in the neighborhood? Now that you mention it, I haven't seen her doing her usual rounds lately. She used to walk the whole street every week, but recently I've only seen her around your area. That does seem odd." After work that day, Amelia decided to attend the monthly HOA board meeting. She wanted to understand exactly what authority Margaret had and whether the other board members were aware of her behavior. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood's main entrance. When Amelia walked into the meeting room, conversation stopped abruptly. Margaret was sitting at the head of a long table with 4 other board members, and about a dozen residents were scattered throughout the chairs in front of them. Margaret's eyes narrowed when she saw Amelia, and she whispered something to the man sitting next to her. "Good evening," Amelia said politely, taking a seat in the back row. "I'm Dr. Amelia Johnson from Maple Street. I wanted to introduce myself and learn more about how the HOA operates." The other board members looked uncomfortable, glancing between Amelia and Margaret. Finally, the treasurer, a nervous-looking man in his 60s, cleared his throat. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Dr. Johnson. I'm Robert Chen, the HOA treasurer. We're always happy to have new residents participate in community affairs." Margaret shot Robert a sharp look that clearly communicated her displeasure with his welcoming tone. "Yes, well, we were just discussing some compliance issues that have arisen recently. It seems some new residents aren't fully understanding the importance of maintaining community standards." "That's interesting," Amelia said calmly. "I'd love to hear more about those standards. For instance, I've been wondering about the inspection protocols. Could you explain the process for property inspections?" The board members exchanged confused glances. "Inspections?" asked Janet Miller, the secretary. "We don't typically conduct property inspections unless there's a serious complaint filed by multiple residents." Margaret's face began to turn red. "What I meant was routine compliance monitoring. It's my responsibility as president to ensure that all residents are following the guidelines." "I see," Amelia said. "And how often do you conduct this monitoring on other properties?" "I'd be interested to know if the frequency is consistent across all homes." The room grew uncomfortable as it became clear that Margaret was being put on the spot. Robert Chen shuffled his papers nervously. "Perhaps we could discuss specific concerns after the meeting?" But Amelia wasn't finished. "I'd also like to understand the violation notice process. I've received several citations in my first week, and I want to make sure I understand the appeal procedure." "Several citations?" Janet Miller looked shocked. "In 1 week? That seems unusual. Margaret, what were the violations for?" Margaret fumbled with her papers, clearly not expecting to have her actions questioned in front of the entire board. "Standard infractions. Parking irregularities, mailbox positioning, noise complaints." "Noise complaints?" Robert Chen asked. "Who filed noise complaints?" The question hung in the air as Margaret realized she had walked into a trap. She couldn't admit that she had filed the complaints herself based on her own observations, because that would reveal the biased nature of her monitoring. But she also couldn't name other residents who had complained, because no one else had. "The complaints came through proper channels," Margaret said vaguely, which satisfied no one in the room. After the meeting, several residents approached Amelia privately. Mrs. Patterson's son, David, who lived 2 streets over, was particularly apologetic. "Dr. Johnson, I want you to know that not everyone supports what's been happening," he said quietly. "Some of us have noticed Margaret's behavior, but we weren't sure how to address it. To be honest, we were worried about becoming targets ourselves." Another neighbor, Linda Rodriguez, nodded in agreement. "I've lived here for 8 years and I've never seen anything like this. Margaret has always been strict, but this is different. She's been walking past your house multiple times every day, taking pictures, making notes. It's like she's trying to build a case against you." "Has anyone else experienced this level of scrutiny?" Amelia asked. The neighbors looked at each other uncomfortably before David answered. "Not like this. There have been complaints over the years, but usually they're handled quietly. A friendly conversation, maybe a gentle reminder about a rule. Nothing like the formal violation notices you've been getting." As Amelia drove home that night, she felt a mix of validation and frustration. It was clear that her treatment was unusual and unfair, but it was also clear that the other residents, while sympathetic, were too intimidated to take any meaningful action. Margaret had created an atmosphere of fear where people were afraid to speak up against her authority. The situation took a more serious turn the following week when Amelia arrived home from a particularly difficult day at the hospital to find police cars in her driveway. 2 officers were standing on her porch, looking slightly embarrassed when they saw her. "Dr. Johnson?" the older officer asked. "We received a call about suspicious activity at this address. Someone reported seeing unfamiliar people entering the house and loud noises coming from inside." Amelia felt her heart racing with a combination of anger and disbelief. "Officers, I live here. I'm the homeowner, and I've been at the hospital all day performing surgery. There's been no one in my house and certainly no loud noises." The younger officer looked uncomfortable. "We're sorry to bother you, ma'am. We have to respond to all calls, but it's clear this was a misunderstanding. Do you have any idea who might have called this in?" Amelia glanced toward Margaret's house, where she could see a figure quickly moving away from the window. "I have some suspicions, but I can't prove anything." After the police left, Amelia sat in her car for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Having the police called on her for simply coming home to her own house felt like a violation that went far beyond petty HOA disputes. This was an attempt to criminalize her very presence in the neighborhood. That night, Amelia made several important phone calls. The first was to her attorney, David Kim, who specialized in civil rights law. The second was to her colleague, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had connections in the real estate community. And the third was to her uncle Marcus, a retired investigator who had taught her the importance of documenting everything when facing discrimination. "Uncle Marcus," she said when he answered the phone, "I need your help. Someone is trying to make my life impossible, and I think it's time to fight back. But I want to do this the right way, with evidence and legal backing." "Tell me everything," Marcus said. "And I mean everything. Every interaction, every violation notice, every strange incident. If someone is targeting you, we're going to document it so thoroughly that they'll regret ever starting this fight." As Amelia began recounting her experiences to her uncle, she realized that Margaret Henderson had made a critical mistake. She had assumed that Amelia would be an easy target, someone who would be intimidated into leaving or at least staying quiet about unfair treatment. But Margaret had no idea who she was really dealing with, or how far Amelia was willing to go to protect her rights and her home. Armed with advice from her uncle and attorney, Amelia began what she privately called Operation Documentation. She installed discreet security cameras around her property, started keeping a detailed log of every interaction with Margaret, and began photographing other houses in the neighborhood to document the selective enforcement of HOA rules. The evidence she gathered was overwhelming. While Margaret continued to cite Amelia for minor infractions like grass being a quarter-inch too tall or leaving her car in the driveway overnight, Amelia's photos showed numerous similar or worse violations throughout the neighborhood that went completely ignored. Mrs. Chen had been parking her boat trailer in her driveway for 3 weeks. The Morrison family had Christmas lights still hanging in March. The Patel house had a broken fence post that had been leaning for months, but Margaret's behavior became even more aggressive as winter turned to spring. She began showing up at Amelia's house at increasingly inappropriate times, sometimes as early as 6 in the morning, or as late as 9 at night. She claimed these visits were for follow-up inspections or noise monitoring, but her real purpose seemed to be intimidation. Breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in April. Amelia had invited several colleagues from the hospital over for dinner, including Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, the head of cardiology, and Dr. Michael Thompson, a respected surgeon who happened to be white. It was meant to be a quiet evening of good food and professional conversation, a chance for Amelia to show off her new home to people she worked with every day. The evening was going perfectly. Amelia had prepared her grandmother's famous lasagna recipe, and her colleagues were impressed with both the food and her beautiful house. They were sitting in the living room, discussing a challenging case they had worked on together, when the doorbell rang insistently. Amelia opened the door to find Margaret standing on her porch, completely soaked from the rain, with her clipboard wrapped in plastic and a stern expression on her face. Behind her stood 2 men Amelia didn't recognize, both wearing official-looking jackets. "Dr. Johnson," Margaret said loudly, clearly intending for Amelia's guests to hear every word. "I need to speak with you immediately about a serious matter. There have been multiple complaints about excessive noise and unauthorized gatherings at this property." Amelia felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. Her colleagues had gone quiet in the living room, obviously listening to the confrontation at the door. "Margaret, I'm hosting a dinner party for a few friends from work. We've been talking quietly in my living room. There's been no excessive noise, and I don't need authorization to have guests in my own home. According to HOA Regulations Section 9.4, gatherings of more than 4 people require advance notification to the board," Margaret declared, consulting her clipboard. "I count at least 6 cars in your driveway and on the street in front of your house." "That's ridiculous," Amelia said, her patience finally snapping. "Those regulations apply to large parties or events, not small dinner gatherings. And even if they did apply, you can't just show up in the middle of my dinner and demand that my guests leave." Margaret smiled coldly and gestured to the 2 men behind her. "This is Mr. Bradley from the City Noise Ordinance Office and Mr. Foster from Neighborhood Compliance. They're here to document the violations and issue formal citations." Dr. Gonzalez appeared behind Amelia, clearly concerned about the confrontation. "Is everything all right, Amelia?" Margaret's eyes lit up with malicious satisfaction. "And who might you be?" Do you live in this neighborhood? I'll need to see identification from all non-residents. Dr. Gonzalez looked stunned. As the head of cardiology at one of the city's most prestigious hospitals, she was accustomed to being treated with respect. I'm Dr. Patricia Gonzalez. I work with Dr. Johnson at City General Hospital. We're having a private dinner and I don't understand why that requires identification. Everyone needs to provide identification, Margaret insisted. We've had reports of suspicious activity, and we need to verify that all visitors have legitimate business in this neighborhood. At this point, Dr. Thompson joined them at the door, along with the other dinner guests. The sight of several well-dressed professional people clearly confused the two men Margaret had brought with her. Mr. Bradley, the noise ordinance officer, looked particularly uncomfortable. Ma'am, Mr. Bradley said to Margaret, I've been standing outside for 10 minutes, and I haven't heard any noise violations. These people are just talking normally in their own home. Margaret's face began to turn red. The complaints were about earlier this evening. There was loud music and shouting. That's completely false, Amelia said firmly. We've been playing soft background music and having normal conversation. And I have security cameras that can prove it. Mr. Foster, the compliance officer, was looking increasingly skeptical of Margaret's claims. Mrs. Henderson, when you called our office, you said there was a large unauthorized party with dozens of people and loud music that could be heard from the street. What I'm seeing here is a small dinner party with professional adults having a quiet evening. The situation has obviously de-escalated since I called, Margaret said defensively. But the violation still occurred. Dr. Thompson, who had been quietly observing the entire interaction, stepped forward. Excuse me, but I'm Dr. Michael Thompson from City General Hospital. I've been here for 3 hours, and I can assure you that there has been no loud music, no shouting, and no behavior that could reasonably be considered disruptive. This appears to be harassment of my colleague. The word harassment seemed to hit Margaret like a physical blow. She realized that her attempt to embarrass Amelia in front of her colleagues had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making Amelia look bad, she had made herself look petty and unreasonable in front of several respected medical professionals. I'm just trying to maintain community standards, Margaret said weakly, but her authority was crumbling in front of everyone's eyes. Mr. Bradley closed his notebook. Mrs. Henderson, I'm not going to issue any citations tonight. There's clearly no noise violation occurring here. In the future, please make sure your complaints are accurate before calling our office. After the officials left, Margaret stood alone on Amelia's porch in the rain, looking smaller and less intimidating than she ever had before. But instead of apologizing or backing down, she seemed to become even more determined. This isn't over, she said quietly, just loud enough for Amelia to hear. I know what you're trying to do, and I won't let you destroy this neighborhood. The next morning, Amelia found an envelope taped to her front door. Inside was an official-looking document with the HOA letterhead at the top. The letter was long and filled with legal-sounding language, but the main message was clear. The HOA board had voted to revoke Amelia's residency privileges due to repeated violations of community standards and failure to maintain appropriate neighborly conduct. The letter demanded that Amelia vacate the property within 30 days or face legal action. It was signed by Margaret Henderson as HOA president, and it claimed to have the full support of the entire board of directors. Amelia read the letter 3 times, her anger growing with each reading. The document was obviously Margaret's own creation, filled with made-up legal terminology and threats that had no basis in reality. But it was also clearly an escalation that showed Margaret was willing to go to extreme lengths to drive Amelia from the neighborhood. That afternoon, Amelia called her attorney David Kim and read him the entire letter over the phone. His response was immediate and reassuring. Amelia, this letter is complete nonsense. No HOA has the authority to revoke someone's residency privileges or force them to sell their home. This woman has just handed us a smoking gun that proves her harassment campaign. But more importantly, she's made claims about board approval that we can easily verify. What do you mean? HOA board meetings are required by law to keep minutes and records of all votes. If she's claiming the board voted to remove you, there should be documentation of that meeting and that vote. My guess is that no such meeting ever occurred, which means she's forged official HOA documents. David's next suggestion surprised Amelia. I think it's time to do some research into the property records for your neighborhood. Something about this whole situation doesn't add up. Margaret is going to extraordinary lengths to get rid of you. and I want to understand why. That evening, Amelia sat in her study with her laptop, following the research trail that David had suggested. She started with the basic property records for Willowbrook Heights, but as she dug deeper, she began to uncover information that changed everything she thought she knew about her new neighborhood. What she discovered would turn Margaret's campaign against her into the biggest mistake of Margaret's life. The documents on Amelia's computer screen revealed secrets about Willowbrook Heights that even Margaret didn't know. Secrets that would completely shift the balance of power in their conflict. As Amelia printed out page after page of property records, financial documents, and corporate filings, she realized that Margaret had been trying to intimidate the wrong person. Tomorrow she would turn the tables in a way that Margaret could never have anticipated. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and Amelia had spent the entire week preparing for what she knew would be the final confrontation with Margaret. Her attorney David Kim would be accompanying her, and they had prepared a presentation that would expose not only Margaret's harassment campaign but also some very interesting facts about the neighborhood's power structure. Word had spread throughout Willowbrook Heights that something big was going to happen at the meeting. The community center was packed with more residents than had attended an HOA meeting in years. People sensed drama in the air, and nobody wanted to miss what was clearly going to be a showdown between the new resident and the longtime HOA president. Margaret sat at the head of the board table, looking confident and composed. She had clearly prepared her own presentation about why Amelia needed to be removed from the community. Several official-looking folders were stacked in front of her, and she kept glancing toward the entrance with a smug expression, as if she couldn't wait for Amelia to arrive so she could deliver the final blow. When Amelia walked into the room with David Kim, the conversations stopped immediately. But instead of looking intimidated or defeated, Amelia appeared calm and confident. She was dressed in a professional navy blue suit, and she carried a leather briefcase that suggested she was ready for serious business. "Good evening, everyone," Amelia said as she took a seat in the front row. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I think you're going to find this meeting very educational." Margaret called the meeting to order with unusual enthusiasm. "Before we begin with regular business, I have an important matter to address regarding a serious threat to our community standards. As you all know, we've been dealing with ongoing violations and disruptions from one of our newer residents." She launched into a prepared speech about the importance of maintaining property values and community harmony. She described Amelia's various violations in dramatic terms, making them sound like serious threats to the neighborhood's character. She waved the fake eviction notice she had created, claiming it represented the unanimous will of the board and the community. Therefore, Margaret concluded dramatically, "I am calling for a vote to formally remove Dr. Johnson from our community and require the immediate sale of her property to someone who will respect our values and standards." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Several board members looked shocked, including Robert Chen, the treasurer, who raised his hand tentatively. "Margaret, I don't remember voting on any such resolution. When did the board meet to discuss this?" Margaret's confidence wavered slightly. "We've discussed this extensively in informal conversations. Sometimes urgent matters require quick action to protect the community." David Kim stood up smoothly. "Excuse me, Mrs. Henderson, but could you clarify something for me?" "I'm David Kim, Dr. Johnson's attorney. Are you claiming that the HOA board has the legal authority to force a homeowner to sell their property?" "Of course we do," Margaret snapped. "The HOA has broad powers to maintain community standards." "I see," David said, opening his briefcase. "And this authority is outlined where exactly in your bylaws?" Margaret fumbled with her papers, clearly not expecting to be challenged on legal grounds. It's implied in our general enforcement powers." "Actually, it's not," David replied calmly. "In fact, no homeowners association in this state has the authority to force a property sale except in cases of extreme financial delinquency, which clearly doesn't apply here. But let's set that aside for a moment and talk about something more interesting." David nodded to Amelia, who stood and addressed the crowd. "Over the past month, I've been the target of a harassment campaign that has included false violation notices, unwarranted police calls, and attempts to intimidate my guests. But while documenting this harassment, I discovered some fascinating information about our neighborhood that I think everyone should know." Amelia opened her own briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. How many of you know who actually owns the most property in Willowbrook Heights? The crowd murmured with confusion. Margaret looked nervous for the first time all evening. I did some research into the property records, Amelia continued, and I discovered that the largest single property owner in our community isn't a longtime resident or a major real estate company. It's actually Johnson Medical Properties, LLC. The room went completely silent. Margaret's face had gone pale. Johnson Medical Properties is a real estate investment company that I founded 5 years ago, with profits from my medical practice, Amelia explained. We specialize in purchasing rental properties in stable, well-maintained neighborhoods. And it turns out that we own 4 houses in Willowbrook Heights, including the Patterson House, the Chen property on Elm Street, the Rodriguez duplex, and the corner house on Oak Avenue. Robert Chen nearly fell off his chair. You mean my landlord is you? That's correct, Amelia said with a slight smile. I've been your landlord for 3 years, Mr. Chen. You've been an excellent tenant, by the way. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up in the back of the room. Wait, does that mean you own my house too? I own the building you live in, yes, Amelia confirmed. You rent the upstairs unit and the Patel family rents the downstairs unit. Again, you've both been wonderful tenants. The implications of this revelation were sinking in throughout the room. Margaret had been harassing someone who was not only a homeowner, but actually one of the most significant property owners in the entire community. But Amelia wasn't finished. There's more. As part of my research, I also looked into the HOA's finances and discovered some irregularities that I think the community should know about. David Kim handed Amelia another set of documents. According to these financial records, the HOA has been paying a community management fee of $2,000 per month to Henderson Property Services. Mrs. Henderson, could you explain what services your company provides for this fee? Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That's for administrative services and community oversight. Interesting, Amelia said, because according to the original HOA bylaws, the president position is supposed to be volunteer, and all administrative work is supposed to be handled by the management company we pay separately. So essentially, you've been paying yourself $24,000 per year from HOA funds without proper authorization from the community. The room exploded in angry voices. Residents who had been quietly paying increased HOA fees for years suddenly realized where their money had been going. David Kim raised his voice to restore order. Ladies and gentlemen, if I may, we're prepared to file several legal actions based on what we've discovered. First, we'll be filing a civil rights complaint with the State Housing Authority regarding the discriminatory harassment campaign against Dr. Johnson. Second, we'll be requesting a full audit of HOA finances and the immediate suspension of any unauthorized payments. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as a desperate squeak. This is all a misunderstanding. I was just trying to maintain community standards. I had no idea about the property ownership situation. The property ownership situation shouldn't matter, Amelia said firmly. Every resident deserves to be treated with equal respect and fairness, regardless of how much property they own. But since you seem to care about property values and community influence, let me be clear about something. Amelia looked directly at Margaret as she delivered her final point. As one of the largest stakeholders in this community, I have a significant financial interest in maintaining property values and community harmony. Your harassment campaign and unauthorized financial activities have been putting both of those things at risk. So yes, I do want to see changes in how this HOA operates, but not the changes you were expecting. The vote that followed was swift and unanimous. Margaret Henderson was removed as HOA president effective immediately, and the board voted to conduct a full investigation into the financial irregularities. Several residents volunteered to form a committee to review HOA policies and ensure that all residents were treated fairly in the future. As the meeting broke up, dozens of neighbors approached Amelia to apologize for not speaking up sooner and to welcome her properly to the community. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman from across the street, was particularly apologetic. Dr. Johnson, I'm so sorry about what you've been through, she said with tears in her eyes. We all knew Margaret was being unfair, but we were too scared to stand up to her. You showed us how to fight back the right way. Margaret gathered her papers and left the meeting without saying another word to anyone. She would resign from the board entirely the following week and move out of Willowbrook Heights within 2 months. unable to face the community she had tried so hard to control. 3 months later, Amelia was hosting her second dinner party in her beautiful home on Maple Street. This time, the guests included not only her colleagues from the hospital, but also several of her neighbors, including Robert Chen and his family, Mrs. Rodriguez and her daughter, and Mrs. Patterson, who had become a close friend and unofficial neighborhood grandmother. As Amelia looked around her dining room at the diverse group of people laughing and sharing stories, she reflected on how much had changed since that first uncomfortable encounter with Margaret. The neighborhood was more welcoming now, more inclusive, and definitely more peaceful. The new HOA board had implemented anti-discrimination policies, established clear procedures for handling complaints, and created a community fund to help residents who needed assistance with home maintenance. Property values had actually increased since the changes were made, as word spread that Willowbrook Heights was a neighborhood where everyone was truly welcome. Amelia never sought revenge against Margaret Henderson. She didn't need to. The truth had been powerful enough on its own. Sometimes the best way to fight prejudice and intimidation is simply to stand your ground, document everything, and let the facts speak for themselves. And sometimes, it doesn't hurt to do your homework and discover that you have more power than your opponents ever imagined.